I could describe many undemocratic and damaging aspects of the current educational system, but in my talk today, I'm just going to focus on just 6 key indicators of educational inequality. And the first is the educational attainment gap between different classes and ethnic groups. In 2010, the OECD estimated that social class intake accounted for over 77% of the performance difference between British schools. Only Luxembourg had a higher percentage, and the OECD average of 55% was much lower. Only 28% of white British students on free school meals achieved the threshold of 5 A to C's at GCSE, compared to 62% of white British students not on free school meals. However, Black Caribbean working class boys don't do any better than white working class boys, while Black Caribbean children from middle class families substantially underperform in comparison to their white middle-class peers. And this is not just a problem at secondary level. These children are falling behind at age 4 to 7 and dropping even further behind when they get to 7 to 11. And these equality gaps can't be fixed by just focusing on a small number of failing schools. No school has managed to reverse this within-school pattern of free school meal children doing worse than non-free school meal children, or Black Caribbean students making less progress than white British students. My second indicator is the well-being and happiness of school students. And the Children's World Report of 2015 looked at a very diverse group of 15 nations, including Ethiopia, South Korea, and Norway. And it found that English children fared badly in terms of their feelings about their life at school. And they were the least positive about the statement, "I like going to school," with only 26% agreeing totally with the statement and 28% agreeing a little or not at all. And this could have something to do with the fact that English children are the most tested in the world. And as you see on this slide, English students are bottom of the league table in relation to their self-confidence and not much higher in relation to life satisfaction, school experience, and relationships with teachers. The English children were also the most likely to complain about being left out by their peers at school. My third indicator is spending per pupil across different types of schools. And of course, the private schools have always been about prioritising the education of the rich few at the expense of the less affluent many. And in 2015, spending per head in the private sector remains 2.5 times spending per head in the state-maintained sector. But now we're seeing inequalities in spending across the state sector as well. And this has resulted in a hierarchy of schooling that replicates the Football League. So we've got a Premier League, the Championship, League One and League Two. And in this competitive, cutthroat environment, the state-maintained comprehensive is increasingly relegated to the lower leagues. And spending is channeled to the top of the hierarchy, leaving schools at the bottom struggling. So 2010-11, £69 million originally allocated to underachieving schools was taken to pay for extra spending on academies. And by 2012-13, this amount had risen to £400 million. In 2013-14, England's free schools received 60% more funding per head than local authority schools. So the average amount of funding given to free schools was £7,761 a head, compared to a figure of £4,767 per head for local authority schools. So this unfair distribution of resources is making a major contribution to inequalities in education, both between the state and private sector, but also within the state sector itself. My fourth level of indicator is levels of segregation and polarisation between schools and within them. And this growing hierarchy of school provision is resulting in increased class and racial segregation. I've been researching in English schools for over 25 years. I now see schools that are 100% working class, schools where over 90% of the intake are ethnic minority, as well as schools that are predominantly white and middle class. Clearly, the private schools are siphoning off the elite from the rest of us, but current research shows that within the state sector, converter academies and grammar schools are particularly problematic for levels of segregation. But there's also emerging evidence on free schools that show similar patterns of segregation. And segregated schools limit the possibilities for empathy and wider understanding and knowledge. And they also increase the social distance between different groups in society. There's a need to counter this class and racial segregation by promoting and rewarding social mix in schools. But social mix in schools will have limited impact if we go on educating children in segregated sets and streams. And my research on the white middle classes who sent their children to multi-ethnic urban comprehensives shows that they mostly experienced a class-segregated education in the top sets. And here we see Davina, who says, it's good because if you're in set 1, you know you're top of the pile. And this language of top of the pile clearly indicates a sense of superiority that processes of setting and streaming encourage and promote. It also results in the low levels of well-being I've talked about earlier, as children in the lower sets internalise a sense of failure and worthlessness. My fifth indicator is the degree to which children have access to a broad and balanced curriculum. And in 2015, we're finding a gap opening up between the curriculum offered to the upper and middle classes and that on offer to working class children. This has always been the situation between the private and the state sector, but now differences in the quality and breadth of curriculum on offer are opening up within the state sector as well. And here we see the RSA's own research found that the curriculum taught to children in poorer parts of Britain is significantly different to that taught in wealthier areas. And the obsessive preoccupation with testing and assessment has turned education into a punishment for many working class children, as they're drilled in the 3 R's in order to help schools raise their league table position. And children in the predominantly working class schools that I visited over the 2010s talked regularly about rarely doing art and music and missing out on dance and drama. And this wasn't the case for the children in the middle-class primary schools that I visited, and yet they had parents who could afford enriching out-of-school activities, while the working-class parents could not. And no one would dispute that the 3 R's are important, but teaching children to be caring, cooperative, respectful, and knowledgeable about their own and other people's histories is equally, if not more, important. We need to develop pedagogies that teach students to question, as well as develop political and social awareness. Critical thinking, problem solving, and creativity should be at the heart of any national curriculum, not at its margins. My last indicator is teachers' levels of satisfaction and professional autonomy. Over the last 20 years, teaching and the teacher have been reduced to a list of skills and competencies that can be measured against standards set by government agencies. This assault on teachers' professionalism has been accompanied by a blame culture in which blaming teachers has become a political blood sport. In 2012, a survey found that teachers were more stressed and insecure at work than any time over the last 30 years. Teachers are feeling worried, weary, and wary. Last month, a young London secondary school teacher told me, 5 years ago, I'd feel nauseous at the thought of going back to school after the summer holiday. But since things have got so much worse, the thought of going back actually makes me physically sick. I throw up. I've just come back from Finland, where teaching is the most respected profession in the country. They express disbelief when I talk about the condition of teachers in the UK. We need, as they have in Finland, a high-status system of teacher education in which teachers are prepared as public intellectuals and confident experts in their field. So, to conclude, developing a fair educational system demands bold, flexible, radical solutions that accord equal value and respect to all, regardless of differences of gender, race, and class. And see social justice not in the sense that it's been appropriated by the right, but in terms of equal treatment and provision. Education in Britain has always been underpinned by the belief that only a minority could or should succeed. Tinkering with an unjust system that's not fit for purpose simply moves the inequalities around from one part of the system to another. Any government that's serious about reducing inequalities in education will need to look at the whole system and its relationship to the wider economy and society. We will never achieve a socially just educational system in a society where competitive individualism is rife and the working classes are seen to be deficient, written off as those who are failing to make themselves middle class. Rather, the educational system we need is one that accepts and develops the best qualities of working class living, and not one that valorises and idealises the upper and middle classes as the best learners, those who deserve more because they already have more. And as Alan Bennett said last year in his talk at Cambridge University, we all know that to educate not according to ability, but according to the social situation of the parents, is not only wrong, but a waste. Before I end, I want to identify at least 3 of the elephants in the room. 1, the wider economy. And there's now conclusive evidence that if we reduce economic inequalities, then educational inequalities will fall. 2, the prevalent culture of neoliberal capitalism. We're living in a society pervaded with an ethic of competitive self-interest rather than the common good. And finally, but not least, the private school system. It's so widely seen to be invested with all that's the best and the brightest in UK society that anything other than wide-ranging changes in relation to the sector will fail to shift our elitist status quo. Thank you.